Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another session in our 2021 Climate Action webinar series. My name is Frank Bostrom, and I'm the co-chair of AIA Coats Education Committee, and I'll be your moderator for today's segment. Most of you know that AIA California has developed an in-depth series focused on understanding and implementing the AIA Framework for Design Excellence. And this is a series that will run through the end of this year and will feature monthly hour-long general climate action webinars, as well as 90-minute webinars that dive deeper into technical topics. Additionally, AIA California has partnered with various organizations with like-minded goals to bring bonus content to you in the comfort of your office or wherever you may find them. Could be under a tree in the park, that all works. As always, all webinar content and additional resources will be available on the AIA California website shortly after each session. A few quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. Today's session qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units for those watching live, and AIA staff will report those units to you, to National AIA for you, so you don't have to worry about that. So the session is also being recorded and will be posted on the AIA California website with additional resources and a PDF of the presentation that we see today shortly after the presentation is complete. As a reminder, please use the Q&A function to ask any question for today's presenters. If it ends up in the wrong box, then we have to chase the question. So please use the Q&A function. That's where we're going to be looking. All the questions will be answered at the end of the session. If any of the questions aren't answered, they will be answered and the responses will be posted online. Now we get on to today's webinar. Life can't exist without clean and available water. Our water infrastructure system needs to utilize this resource more efficiently so that we can deal with changes to climatic conditions and the fluctuations of available water that result. It's time to rethink and redesign how we use stormwater in our urbanized areas. Very quickly, I'd like to introduce today's presenters before handing it over to them. Jim MacRae is very passionate about designing places that honor nature, people, and culture. His career has taken him across the globe from North America, Asia, and the Middle East. And these professional experiences have sharpened his technical capacity and his appreciation for work in diverse natural and urban environments. He has a broad expertise, but is best known for his planning and design and thoughtful urban environments, including transit-oriented districts, commercial corridors, urban parks, and plazas, as well as sustainable mixed-use communities. Jimmy GALVEZ leads the Los Angeles office here in California, yay, California, and has extensive experience working for a range of clients, public and private, on a variety of project types, from large-scale institutional and higher education projects to civil infrastructure and green street design and implementation. He's been responsible for preparation of plans for land development projects, including site design, relevant calculations and project specifications, and has led the preparation of cost and bond estimates for private improvement projects. Jimmy has also served as a project lead in coordination with government agencies, outside consultants, office team members and contractors, and helps run Sherwood's Los Angeles office. Jason Lucelle is the managing principal of the New York office of Sherwood Design Engineers, leading many of the most progressive projects, including Brooklyn Bridge Park, Houston Yards, and the Corton Water Treatment Plant Water Reclamation System. We got water in there twice. That was good. All right. Along with South San Francisco Bay, he is leading the design of the water systems on the redevelopment and expansion of a large tech campus focused on climate adaptation, water and carbon balancing, landscape integrated stormwater, and sea level rise resilience. Very important in the Bay Area. In Tanggu, China, he is spearheading the civil design, ecological planning, and implementation of the 80-hectare Riverfront Park, and in Dubai, he is leading the design for a net zero water pavilion for Expo 2020. At this point, I'm done. Take it away, Jim, Jimmy, and Jason, because that's pretty awesome what I just read.
Well, thanks, Frank, and hello to everybody. I'm glad you could join us. My name is Jim MacRae. I'm a principal, as Frank mentioned, with Design Workshop. I'm an urban designer and landscape architect. When AIA asked me to share some ideas and experiences that we have on green infrastructure as part of our landscape practice, I felt it was important to sort of broaden that beyond just the benefit of sustainable practices for development, to also include and think about the social and economic impacts of what green infrastructure can do to our built environment, whether that's at a small site scale or at a larger kind of urban district level. But green infrastructure involves a lot of people. It takes a talented and innovative set of consultants to deliver on that. And when I was asked to put this seminar together, I immediately thought of Jason and Jimmy and Sherwood design engineers, who we've worked with on many, many projects all over the country, to really participate and to provide another perspective from an engineering perspective on green infrastructure at multiple scales, but especially the building scale that I know many of you are very interested in, specific to Southern California. Next slide. So we've got about a 60-slide presentation for you, but it's going to really start with providing a historical context, which Jimmy's going to talk about. That really being for the LA Basin, Southern California. You know, what has green infrastructure looked like in the past? What does it look like today in terms of the code that is currently in place and the ordinances and low impact development strategies? What sort of co-benefits come from that whole idea of green infrastructure in the code? What kind of approach or strategies can you use to implement green infrastructure? And then Jimmy's going to walk us through several projects that they've done in the LA Basin, mainly sort of at a site and building scale. And then finally, we're going to talk about two projects that are outside of Southern California, but worthy of kind of showcasing or discussing. One of which is a project that Jason and I just completed this past year, which is now in construction. And then finally, we will end with some key takeaways, kind of our collective sort of best practices, hoping that that resonates. And then finally, we'll be happy to take any questions that you might have for us. So with that, I'll turn it over.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the historical context within the city.
Just went on mute again.
Oh, now.
There you go.
Okay.
Sounds like, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
For some reason, it's all right. So from the historical perspective, looking at the birth of Los Angeles, and really the beginnings of LA was this these agrarian roots, right, that began with as it was mentioned earlier, where there's water, there's development, there's growth. Really, the Sangha Madre was that beginning of the city. However, it was all redirecting the water to surface conveyance, and from there began a very gray approach to infrastructure with the city. And so, really directing roof water directly into storm drain pipes with not much, basically no treatment. So from the local code, it's really looking at the different watersheds throughout the greater Los Angeles area, and really beginning to dive as to how the city looks at stormwater management. Their low impact development manual basically describes that pathway, right? That begins to tell us how the the city begins to prioritize stormwater management on the different on site. Their approach is really to prioritize retention, just through infiltration and reuse over detention, which would otherwise be a capture, treat, and release element. And so depending on the size of your project, whether it's a residential project, is it some of those initial questions that we ask ourselves when looking at the size, is it a residential project over and under an acre, or if it's a commercial, industrial project, or even a residential project that's over 5 units, begins to dictate that pathway within the code with the city. And then looking at just what that begins to look like, it's really typically the minimum 3/4 inch 24-hour rain event, or the 85th percentile 24-hour event. Typically for planning purposes, the way that we look at it is at the initial planning stages is really just multiplying what the first 1 inch of storm over an entire site. So just doing some quick math here, over a 10,000 square foot lot parcel, you would be looking at around 834 cubic feet of stormwater to mitigate. That would translate into, if we're looking at an infiltration or even a cistern for reuse, around 6,200 gallons. And if we are going to go the route of fire retention areas, that's a little. The city of LA does provide a penalty for not being able to retain it and just detain it at a 1.5 factor. So you're looking at 9,300 gallons. The co-benefits, really, when looking at site design, there's these different elements of wellness, right, that we want to think about, incorporate. What is that human aspects, what is that campus aspect, and the ecological wellness that brings all these different benefits to site design, as we think about anywhere from materiality to resiliency and health benefits to biodiversity and adaptability and conservation, right? Really different factors depending on your site. And then how these different elements are basically tied back to that infrastructure typology, and they're intertwined with one another as we start looking at those benefits, those benefit overlays. As we looked at watershed management, water supply, urban heat island, really beginning to look at these, again, how these overlay with one another and are intertwined. And so you can begin to develop these micro narratives that begin to provide sort of the initial building blocks of the storyline for that water story on your project. And also one thing that becomes very, very powerful is looking at how, not only how they're interconnected with one another, but also how they are basically stacking overall, right? And what are some of those synergies between one another? And there might be different criteria, right, that apply as that story begins to build up. What different performance factors mean to the different approaches, and these are going to vary from site to site depending on, one, the goals of the project, the design vision, right, as well as the overall arching goals that the client or owner might have for their building or campus. From the approach perspective, we want to look at the water cycle, right, and begin to understand how we want to intercept what would otherwise be a closed loop system, right? That where in a very traditional approach, as we mentioned earlier, with the gray infrastructure, would otherwise be a closed system where you're basically grabbing water and sending it to pipes and out it goes, as opposed to exploring opportunities where you can recharge the water table potentially find those other co-benefits that we were speaking about earlier. And so there's three overarching approaches, right? There's to the very left of this image is the code approach, right? Where there's we have a certain portable demand, a certain amount of runoff, and by code you're asked to detain or retain a certain amount of water. But as we move to the right, if we're looking at say like a lead framework, we can begin to create this intercept this certain amount of water for reuse and begin to create ecological benefits. And if we go to the very far right, is looking at a more aspirational approach where we're really making use of that reuse water and as well as creating more, bringing a lot more value to the ecology understory of the site, or and so really, where we land on this range will depend on the project and those goals, right? As well as what the owner client is looking to achieve. And so in order to do this, right, we have to start with a water balance, really looking at the supply of water. What are some of those supply sources? How much potable water do we have? Is there a recycle system on site? How much rainwater we're going to capture? How much stormwater is available throughout the project site? And then there's that usage. And so how much of that water is going to be for potable use, irrigation, on-site storage, and as well as green infrastructure. And so really beginning to look at those quantities of water to determine what really how these will translate into certain outputs, with how much of that water will go into sewer, evapotranspiration, infiltration, really looking at an entire inventory of the water on site. And that'll begin to set the stage for the decision making. And so we look at this Sankey diagram, really beginning to see the pathways of how water will move through the campus, through your project site, and where that water starts in the supply, to how the water is going to be used, and again, how those outputs are going to translate into city connections or ecological benefits, right? With it, as we dive into these pathways, then we start to talk about the decision making, how these translate into cost. And so for one of our projects, we dove into what it means for water, right? In terms of just complying with the code. And on this specific project, it was somewhere around $38,000 of the cost. But as we look at alternatives, we started looking at what would be a potential aspirational approach, right? Where not only did we bring the costs down for water, but we began to create these ecological and wellness benefits, right, to the site. And understandably so, that sometimes the financial element, right, is something that we definitely want to pay attention to, and so there's a point of how much money goes into these systems, and understanding how that translates into the decision making. There might be a situation where the aspirational element might not get get us as many benefits as we would like. So is there a middle ground where we're somewhere between code compliant and aspirational, right? That begins to be the approach that the project would follow. And this is looking at just overall the water perspective, both from that volume analysis that we did earlier, and then translated into cost. Diving specifically into some of specific projects in the LA area, right, is we talked about those typologies and what these wellness elements, how they provide those lenses through the approach on projects. And so we have 3 projects for you guys that we want to share with you. One of them is Chinatown 7, which is was an adaptive reuse project in the Chinatown district of downtown Los Angeles, basically creating retail and office space along with landscapeable structure through multiple floors. You can see what a substantial grade differential. But as we start looking at the project, really, we started looking at what those constraints are. Right, it's an infill project with a 0 lot line. There's a substantial change in elevation. There's an existing structure to remain with a partial demolition, and then there's some geotechnical findings and requirements that basically did not allow for that water infiltration. And so we began looking at those. How do we turn these what would otherwise be constraints into opportunities, or to build our approach, our water story, right? And so really looking at those opportunities from the building perspective, really focusing the fact that we're just working with the building itself, right? It really focuses the extent of mitigation on the building only. There was no site element that we had to worry about, in really using the elevation over that short distance as a way to support the conveyance strategies of water within the building. So really doing away with any need for pumps or anything like that. And then that flexibility and the adaptive reuse space really began to set the stage for some of those opportunities. And as a way, these geotechnical findings where infiltration was not feasible basically set the stage to have the conversation with the city of LA about, hey, I know that you guys prefer infiltration over other strategies, but it's not feasible based on these geotechnical findings. So it helps with the permitting aspect with city staff. And so the end result is, again, using those geotechnical findings and recommendations to support a detention over retention strategy. And we identified 2 cells within the structure. The part of the structure itself that were converted to cisterns. So it was a win-win because we didn't have to lose any parking spaces. We didn't have to change any of the programming in order to fit these cisterns. And in there provided 70,000 gallons of water that are basically going to be reused for irrigation over the entire structure. The next one is Center for Early Education, and this was one of our larger campus projects, phased redevelopment and expansion, where the school over time acquired a number of parcels in order to expand their facilities, basically doubling up in size. Also, their underground parking garage as well in order to meet that demand. And so in some ways, also another 0 lot line infill project. And the challenging part with this one was how do you keep a private school running? And so you have to basically separate the design, permit, and construction over 7 phases over 5 years in order to keep things keep the school open. Some of those constraints really is interesting. Multiple agencies where was something that we had to work through. The entire school was in West Hollywood, but one of the rear streets that front the project was actually in Beverly Hills. And then from the stormwater perspective, looking at basically leaving LA County regulations. Relatively flat site, which is the it brings its own set of challenges as opposed to a steep site, right? And again, also some of the geotechnical findings and requirements. One of the key aspects with this one is the natural environment before development was there. Is La Cienega, which is the name of the street nearby. La Cienega means it's basically a wetland. Is what the environment was, ecological environment was before the city expanded into this area, right? And so you can imagine a very spongy layer of soil with water that surfaces to the top, and so groundwater was certainly a challenge in this project. And so how do we turn those constraints into opportunities? And so we began to look at identifying common pathways across all 2 or 3 agencies. Really, a lot of project would propose part of the majority of the project was overstructured, but some of it was on grade, and so we began to look at those opportunities as well as we looked at the different phases of the project, and that would inform where did we draw those phase lines. And then there's the design vision was to create, there's no room to put any kind of play or sport facilities other than on structure, right? So what does it mean to put a soccer field on top of the structure, and what are some of those opportunities that come with it? And because we're partially demoing and building part of the school is with it comes a bit of flexibility in where we would be able to put biofiltration planters, and how we potentially can look at redirecting groundwater into some of those planters themselves as well. The result, it's looking at basically is not a one size fits all from the strategy perspective, really tailoring the stormwater management to those opportunities that we find, but to different parts of the site, right? So for example, in the case of the sports field, we were able to take advantage of the structural foam in gravel section below as a stormwater conduit. So really eliminating the need for pipes, but at the same time also that the fact that water is running through those layers provides a cooling effect for that surface when students are playing in the area. And then there's collecting that groundwater and redirecting it. That the groundwater in that area was also being challenged, was a bit of a challenge as well, because there was a nearby gas station that was, there were concerns about the level of contamination, right? So not to make an existing problem worse was being able to intercept that groundwater and running into bioretention elements for treatment as well. And then at the same time providing 2 cisterns, one at 5,600 gallons and one at 5,600 and another one at 5,300, as well as a wet well that not only provided, allowed us to meet that LID mitigation volume, but it also helped attenuate some of the larger storms, which means that we didn't necessarily have to apply or install new outfall connections into the public right away, right? Simplifying the permitting element with the project. And then this is one of our more of our recent projects, maybe not also in LA. Is we're looking at redevelopment of 2 parcels over 155,000 square feet. And it's a combination of existing structures, 77,000 square feet of adaptive reuse, and about 43,000 of square feet of targeted new space for creative office space along with site amenities. And with this one, it's interesting. You see that really looking at beginning to identify the different opportunities that apply to different parts of the site, right? And how do we apply them throughout the different approaches? We found out that for this one, some of those too fast. We find out that one of the key elements of this story is that from the geotechnical standpoint, we find that the site is the existing soil layer allows for infiltration. And so from the code perspective, we can just take that water and put it back on the ground and we're done. But we started looking at opportunities into saying, how do we create a bit more value, right? We calculated, and if we had to send that water directly into an infiltration gallery, we're looking at 96,000 gallons of water. Is there an opportunity for us to, say, skim some of that water and keep it, detain it to meet irrigation demands, and then the rest obviously infiltrated, right? And so over time, that looks at reducing water cost for irrigation, as well as contributes to that water story. In all of these three projects, there is that layer of interaction between the built environment within parcel and then some of those improvements in the public right-of-way. This project is interesting because there's actually a surface stormwater conveyance that the city has over this property. So we have to allow water from the north end of the public right-of-way down to the south end, south frontage of the project. And so is there an opportunity for us to provide a larger benefit? And so that's where we begin to talk about these opportunities that we can bring to the public right-of-way. And so we're going to talk more about that in the next few projects, so what it means for stormwater in the public space. So I'm going to pass it over to the Bagby Street example.
Great. Well, thanks, Jimmy. So those were some really wonderful projects to learn from. What we wanted to do was just to kind of broaden sort of this conversation to look at other examples done elsewhere that we can learn from. And one of those is a project called Bagby Street. Next slide.
Next one.
Yes.
Okay.
So Bagby Street is a public sector project that had private investment benefit. It hasn't changed the slide yet here, Jimmy. I don't know what's going on, but anyway. And as Jimmy said, green infrastructure has multiple co-benefits. For this particular project, the two benefits were, well, three. One was the principal benefit, which was to solve an infrastructure problem that the city of Houston had. And then second, and probably more important, was, if you can go back to the first slide there, Jimmy, the other co-benefits were, as Jimmy mentioned and showed earlier, around the human and the ecological wellness of a 11-block segment of a street that was a urban collector, basically moved people from the downtown CBD of Houston to the outer edge surrounding it, which was an old sort of industrial mercantile district called Midtown. So the project really was about solving an infrastructure, water, stormwater, but it turned quickly into a goal to provide for both traffic calming, human comfort, and pedestrian orientation for a street that really did not have it. And then also to become really a public investment that really spawned all sorts of private investment to occur along it. So next slide. So I won't bore you with all the analysis, but I would just say, as part of a multidisciplinary team, we did a lot of investigation, some baseline studies on all the conditions of this 11 block corridor in the street, from the land uses to retail sales to the traffic volumes, the noise on the street, the infrastructure that existed along this existing street, and certainly the sort of aesthetic qualities, those being principally the trees that were there. And so next slide. So we spent many weeks as a team talking about stormwater and how we could integrate that as part of a green infrastructure project, but more importantly, to really understand sort of what it meant from a human condition or an ecological perspective. And so we measured things like temperature, both air and surface temperatures. We measured noise, the effective noise of cars traveling down this roadway. We measured many sort of baseline conditions for us and the team to basically say, how can we make improvement? How can we broaden this public investment to have multiple benefits, both socially, economically, environmentally? Next slide. So here's a picture of the sort of before. This was taken about 2005. As you can see, like a lot of cities, this being Houston, are served by large roads that basically get people out of an office area to highways and to the suburbs to where they live. And it has, over the time, sort of had an impact on these kind of first inner ring areas like Midtown. So how many cities in LA and Southern California have the same phenomena of these types of conditions? So it was all about getting cars through this area, and it had really nothing to do with sort of the quality of life, the health and wellness of people, or the ecology. Next slide. So through the work of a multidisciplinary team, we were able to, with the city and a district, a kind of a business improvement district that operated this particular area, to turn that into basically, a new converted street, one that was really focused on pedestrians, focused on new urban development, infill development, private investment, focused on the human comfort and the safety of people, and then the ecological benefit from just simple of adding more softscape and trees to shade, to reduce heat island impacts, et cetera. And over the course of about 3 to 5 years after the construction, we were able to, in the district, to their credit, along with the engineers, were able to measure things so that we could see how well this project performed in terms of its human comfort. So we were able to see how the heat index along certain sections of the street changed and were reduced because of these improvements. How much more the pedestrian realm improved in terms of its connectivity and its level of service for pedestrians and bike riders. Next slide. But again, the real point of the project started and was really principally focused on green infrastructure around stormwater. And so the city wanted and needed to build a bigger storm drain to solve some problems between some areas that were inadequate. And we were able to work with the city and the district and the engineering team to devise a plan to say, well, what other strategies might we use in order to maybe reduce the amount of piping and conveyance underground, and maybe reveal that by vis-a-vis the biocells, as we call them, or bioswales, rain gardens, along the edges of the sidewalk between where cars park and where pedestrians walk, to simply act for both water quality and some form of detention. This being designed for a 10-year event, although they are still monitoring and measuring the effectiveness of this water hydrological system and finding it actually operates at about a 20 to 25 years rainfall event, which has far exceeded the design criteria. But again, like other things, there was measurement about the pollutants and the amount of storage that the project had through this idea of green infrastructure. You can go to the next slide. I'd say go to the next. As part of that, this district in Bagby saw a significant amount of private investment right after the project was announced, but it's been going on ever since, And partly what was driving that was that this area was a little bit sort of on the decline, and we were able to help, or the project, I should say, was really able to help catalyze private investment, really to become a place for young people who wanted to live and work in a place that they felt was healthier, that was more sustainable. And so the project, albeit it was a transportation infrastructure project, really turned into a branding opportunity for the district at large and the developers who came to develop here, whether that was retail or commercial or mainly multifamily residential in the form of apartments. So the idea that green infrastructure really can have multiple economic benefits, both from a city point of view, because of the tax and the investments that can be made, but also from a branding where this neighborhood is now highly sought after and has some of the highest rents within the area. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thanks, Jim. And so building off of the Bagby Street example that Jim just went through, this is another case study, and our last case study that we have been working on together, him and I, for the last couple of years, and is now in construction in Des Moines. And so with this one, it kind of builds off of all of the benefits that you just heard from Bagby Street, and then went a little bit further, which I'll lay out for you. So we always start at a very large context, and when it comes to stormwater, the appropriate context is the watershed scale. So it started by looking at all of the conditions within that watershed and then trying to figure out where we fit within that. There's no scale that's too big when it comes to natural systems or water systems to understand where the opportunities and the constraints arise that you can address with your project, whether it's a single building scale or if it's an entire neighborhood like this or something in between. And so this is a section, a similarly blighted component of Des Moines, right on the riverfront, which has been mostly industrial and very underutilized for many years. And so we were working with a development group that was putting together ownership of all of these parcels with the goal of revitalizing this large section of the city, including a waterfront park. You can go to the next one, Jim. So then from a stormwater perspective, it's always important to understand what is pervious and impervious, very basic concept, but it's important to understand how much there is right now and how much impervious surface there is. And then that helps you in where that is. And that helps you inform how the system is functioning within that broader watershed. So you understand what the dynamics are of the watershed and how your site affects it. And that is what informs the solutions that you can come up with. Go to the next one. And so the approach here was to look at a district scale. And by district scale, what we're talking about is going beyond the traditional approach of parcel by parcel. Traditionally, stormwater, similar to most of what we design, is limited to the property line. And so the traditional approach would be to look at the codes and the standards that Jimmy just went through and figure out what is required by that code to achieve those standards. Jimmy can stay on the other slide. But what we found over years of doing much larger scale developments, which have multiple parcels, whether it's institutional campuses, corporate campuses, mixed use neighborhoods like this one here, is that when you look at things in aggregate, there's a lot more opportunity. It's not surprising, but what we have had to do over the years is try to prove this to our clients. We've done a lot of work with tech campuses in the South Bay where they're inundated with huge impacts related to climate change, sea level rise, flooding, contaminated groundwater, and so on and so forth. And so we've been proving to these groups over and over again that by looking at things in aggregate, which has its own challenges, obviously crossing over from one parcel to another has challenges, especially when you're crossing rights of way, but there's a significant financial benefit right from the start. And that's always the starting point for anything that we do. We have to make a CapEx and an OpEx case, a business case or value proposition before we can get any further into all the other co-benefits which exist. So that's always the starting point. Otherwise, it doesn't really get any further than just a conversation. You can go to the next one, Jimmy. And so just, going through the analysis, obviously, to understand how the hydrology works currently, topography is critical. And this was a really counterintuitive site where the river is actually on the left side of that diagram, but the water actually flows to the east and flows inland. So it created some really unique dynamics related to those flow patterns. And that was really critical to understand at the outset, which would otherwise be not intuitive when you're on a waterfront site. Go to the next one. And then based on that, we mapped the watersheds that impact specifically the site and understand where they actually go, and then tried to figure out at each of those design points, as we call them. So each one of those gray circles there is a point at which water exits this district, this neighborhood, this multi-parcel district, and then worked very closely with all of the agencies within the city, whether it was the Department of Transportation, the DPW, to get all of their perspectives on what the issues are, whether it's streetscape redesign that's needed, future plans for improving those streetscapes, ownership structures, and obviously where flooding occurs right now, proposals for upgrading any of those systems. And then given all of those drivers, then we go to the proposed conditions, the next one, Jimmy, and propose some reorganization of that. On this project here, what we learned is that the system to the south actually had less capacity, and there was potential for more capacity on the north. So the initial, I guess, grading study for this site led us to believe that it would make more sense to rejigger those watersheds and direct some of that water to the northern watershed. And then progressing from there, go to the next one, Jimmy. We came up with a preliminary layout of how we could manage that stormwater. And again, at the district scale. So not looking at the actual parcel boundaries, but looking at the district boundaries and being agnostic to the fact that we have multiple public rights of way that are bisecting the site, some new, some that are going to be abandoned, but either way that those are public rights of way. And made this very clear at the outset that this was the goal with this project, was to set a new paradigm for the city, as well as possibly for the region, if not the nation, because this is not the most common approach. But we were able to, through a very strategic process of engagement with all these various city agencies, show the benefits not only to the development of the site, but also to the city as a whole and all of their challenges by approaching it from this perspective. And through that lens, they were able to entertain the approach that we're proposing. And so where we started here, it's a little bit hard to see here, but essentially taking all of the stormwater management requirements, which really boil down to two, pretty much any place you'll find, and that's cleaning the water, it's water quality, and that's where we talk about bioswales and bioinfiltration and that rain gardens and that kind of thing. And then there's flood control. So that's managing the large quantities of water that run off from a site during a large storm event. Typically that's the 100-year storm. So there's the two main all the green strips, all of the I guess vegetated areas as performative infrastructure that could manage the water quality by treating it, cleaning it through a system, an entire network of bioswales, and then second to that, then have the capacity within those bioswales as well as below it to store the large storm events, the flood control. And we were able to, through that assessment, identify that we could do all of that for the entire district just within the right of way. And so from the developer's perspective, that was adding to the incentivizing for future tenants that would be coming in there. So they would be able to come in to the site, and it was almost like a plug and play system related to stormwater. They didn't have to fit within their 0 lot line properties an accommodation for stormwater treatment or flood control, which would typically have resulted in big tanks and mechanical systems that wouldn't provide any other benefit other than just performing that function. And so it was really using a resource that a smart landscape street design that Jim was putting together could also perform the function of stormwater management and doing it within the right of way. And so obviously that begged the question from the city, where has this been done before? How can we manage this? What are the maintenance and the responsibility arrangements? And so we slowly went through that process with them. You go to the next slide, Jimmy. And we were able to agree with them that there is a logical divide at the curb line. And so you can imagine in a new development district like this, the bulk of the expense and the pedestrian experience would happen from the curb line to the property line. And so there would otherwise have been essentially a third-party association that would have been required to manage the unique furnishings, the paving patterns, even the plantings. And so by putting the majority of the stormwater management in that same area. It was just essentially adding an additional piece to that arrangement, which would otherwise have to have been made anyway. And from that perspective, they understood that. And then they were willing to take on the infrastructure that fell within the traveled way, if you will, the area between the curb lines. And that infrastructure was more traditional, and we worked with them to ensure that the pieces of infrastructure in there fell within their standards, so that they felt comfortable with the maintenance regimes necessary to manage all of that. You can go to the next one, Jimmy. Obviously, there was quite a bit of detail to work through. There were a lot of unique elements, similar to putting in unique furnishings or paving patterns, and this just built off of that. But we were able to bring to them precedent from various parts of the country where there have been successful interventions such as these, work through all those construction details, how the maintenance regimes would work, engaged early on with an operations group in the region that has managed these types of projects to ensure we were accommodating the considerations that they have had in their ongoing plans in other places, to ensure the client, the owners, that they weren't buying into a system that couldn't otherwise be maintained or would be some unique process. So we had to translate everything we're proposing into something that was understood in some part way by potential operators. You can keep going, Jimmy. So just more details, and it does take getting into this level of detail to prove those things out. Doing things that are atypical does require translation, but it's really about a clear engagement process, providing precedent, and getting that buy-in early on. And as a result of that very tactical approach that we took, we were able to get that buy-in very seamlessly, which was very nice. However, as in every project, there's always a pivot at some point. And so at pretty much, I'd say 25% DD with cost estimations coming in, we identified that there is a large overrun, big surprise. Value engineering is always a challenge on every project. And so from our perspective on stormwater, we had to look very closely at how the system was working and see if we looked more broadly if there was another option that could reduce some of the capital expenditure related to it. And so what we identified is that the green infrastructure, the bioswales, made a lot of sense. They were co-optimized with the green space that was being designed otherwise for the landscape. But the below grade components that were really about stormwater storage for those big flood events, those were for more of a single purpose, and they were pretty costly. And so in engaging again with the city agencies and some of their consultants who had been doing studies in the past on the broader watershed flood challenges, we identified that, you can keep going, Jimmy. Let's go to the next one. Oh, this is a beautiful rendering that Jim had done on the outcome of what it'll look like in a couple of years. But what we identified there is that there was currently a stormwater pond that was functioning under capacity, underutilized, in a single purpose, essentially a shallow depression in the ground, big public open space, but it was only being used for stormwater storage, and it was not being used very efficiently. And you can see, this is obviously a rendering, but it sits in that kind of amorphous shaped blue area on the bottom right of the plan. It's kind of system of, thanks, Jimmy. That's the area that we identified. In our site, the market district is everything that's in the cyan blue, diagonally to the northwest from there. So it's a pretty good distance from the site, but again, it gets back to looking more broadly at the watershed in the region to try to find opportunities. And so through that value engineering process, we engaged further with the city to reopen the consideration of maybe using that stormwater detention basin, the regional basin, for something more. And we were able to get their buy-in. We created a development agreement with the developer and came up with a number to get them to buy into transferring the stormwater detention from these below grade cells that were going to cost quite a bit of money into this regional park. And as a result, able to create quite a bit more benefit. So the transfer of those funds to the city would not only offset the flood management requirements for the entire district, but would also contribute to solving some of the broader flooding conditions in the larger watershed as well. And then in addition to that, putting that additional money to invest in this, what was otherwise just a utilitarian utilitarian detention basin. This created the opportunity to make this into a functional amenity, not only creating ecological benefit with wetlands and so forth and those types of vegetation, but also an amenity that people could use, an actual park. And so this became a bookend, if you will, to the project. And so the far side of our site, which is along the river, there's planned a waterfront park, and this becomes a bookend on the other side to create almost like a dumbbell balance between these two beautiful open spaces in which this neighborhood is nestled. And all of this was communicated in a way that they could see from the developer side and the city side that there were co-benefits, financial benefits that were amenable to all parties concerned. And this is where
Jason, I think it's, sorry to interrupt. I think it's important to also add, I think you touched on it, which is this idea has now generated the possibility of greater economic impact by virtue of redevelopment that is likely to occur as this wetland park becomes a reality for the city. So it's driving real estate and economic value farther away from the river than if we did not have something like that. That was really a kind of a fortuitous outcome, oddly enough, of kind of our economic reality with the market district.
Very true. Thanks for bringing that up. So that's the end of this study, and I'm sure you feel like you've been pulled away from LA and now you're far flung in Des Moines, Iowa. But to kind of bring it back, like I said, we're doing quite a bit of work, and it's mostly in the South Bay, but a lot of work in California. And we're doing a similar model as this, and there's a specific arrangement that's allowed for by the state of California, where you can develop a community benefit district. And it's essentially a TIF, if you will, but it's to create district infrastructure that can then, such that the development within that area can be taxed, and that taxation can be allocated to maintain larger scale infrastructure such as this. And so I guess the point is that the mechanisms for this type of project exist right there in California. And if anybody's interested, we can send some of that precedent along afterwards, so you know how to translate that back to your work in LA. So a couple of key takeaways, and then we can take any questions that may have arisen. So just kind of bring it all back together. The major things to consider in approaching stormwater is just getting beyond your individual parcel. Just like anything that you're approaching, it's all about the context and identifying what those constraints and opportunities are and how they can influence your site. And I can't stress enough how valuable it is to look at the largest possible context you can. We're always surprised that even on the smallest project, looking out even miles, you can find some sort of pattern that can inform either a narrative or an actual, concrete benefit to your design. And then ROI, obviously dollars and cents is right up front. It always has to be, unfortunately, but we're never able to be successful unless we're able to make a financial value proposition. So that's the return on investment. And then the benefits, that's the fun stuff, all the co-benefits, look across the board. I mean, we're talking about ecology and we're talking about water management and public space, but there are lots of other things too. And water reuse is a big part of that. A lot of times when you're managing stormwater, you end up triggering something that gets you into a position where stormwater reuse can become valuable. And that's another benefit that can come out. So keeping your mind open to that, as well as, climate change isn't just about increased precipitation and storm surge. It's also about temperature increases and heat island impacts. And there are real quantifiable metrics that we're working on and others as well to show what those benefits are to reducing the heat island effect associated with green infrastructure and thoughtful landscape design. And we can show some of that stuff if anybody has questions. And then just getting away from accepting the code. I know we're speaking to urban designers and architects and landscape architects. I'm sure there's some engineers in there as well, but our approach is always to look at what the intent of the code is. So the codes are written for a purpose. Don't assume that the way the code is written is the only way it could have been written to achieve that purpose. So, challenge your engineers, challenge yourselves to look beyond and figure out what the driver is and then approach your response to that driver rather than just the prescriptive code. And then the integration between the public and private partnerships. You see that all the time, and it's no different with stormwater management. There are plenty of arrangements that can be made to manage between both parties. And it ends up creating much more benefit when two parties work together. So that's the extent of what we got for you today. So I'm not sure what the process is, but any questions you all have, happy to field them.
Okay. I got one quick question before we jump into the ones here. In all the examples you gave, you're dealing with volumes and quantities of water. So in the design process, you have to establish annual rainfall, or you're going to be talking about 5, 10, 15, 50-year storm conditions. Because all of those determine the amount of volume of water that you have to deal with. How does that handled in the design process?
Yeah, and it actually goes, I mean, like I was saying, there's two different ways to look at stormwater that you have to. One is the cleaning of it. Urban runoff is dirty. Unfortunately, it runs off of impervious surfaces, gathers all the sediment that's sitting there, and that sediment is like a sponge that picks up all the contaminants, whether it's the oils or the metals or what have you. So cleaning that is number one. And that's related to every storm event. Every time it rains, it's that first half inch or so that picks all that stuff up. And so quantifying that volume, which happens, could be monthly, could be weekly, depending on what climate you're in, that's the first quantification you have to get to. And that's called your water quality volume. And that's where your green infrastructure really does most of its work. That's filtration of all those contaminants. And the other quantification is about trying to pick the right design storm that could create flood conditions. And so that's identifying what the flood conditions are. And so again, back to kind of challenging code. Typical code is written with, like you were just saying, Frank, a 10-year, 50-year, 100-year storm. But depending on where you are, it may be a smaller storm event that's creating localized flooding. So it's identifying what storm events are actually creating the biggest problems and addressing those, and not just jumping to what the code prescribes you to do. Doesn't mean you don't have to also accommodate for the code prescribed storm events, which are usually the 100-year, but it's important to understand the context of your site and what storm conditions affect it. Is that close to answering your question?
Yeah, I've always been sort of curious or enamored by, you have cleaning capacity and pump capacity, and you've got how much water is coming in at the same time. And at some point, you're going to say, I have enough capacity to keep up with what's coming, or I don't. And that's all, to filter, to process water costs money. That's where it gets expensive. So designing the equipment capacity to handle the volume that you're coming, that's the conundrum, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's one of the many benefits to green infrastructure is it's not pumped, it's not piped, it's using the landscape that you otherwise need to have a thriving pedestrian oriented community. And so it's co-optimizing with that landscape.
And that, I think it also reinforces what Jason said earlier, which is sort of looking beyond your project site, right? Because that issue that you're probably trying to solve for is what everybody else needs to try to solve for. So if you can sort of leverage that as a kind of a communal issue and to find a strategy that everybody can win from, right? A win-win condition in the end, that's going to be a better solution than a just one-by-one approach. Now that's not always possible, but I do think a lot of these projects do involve that sort of possibility, or at least discussion about the what if we were able to do it this way, as opposed to solving it in a more myopic kind of perspective.
Good. We'll start here. Bagby Street project. Can you talk a little bit about costs? Can you talk about the cost per square foot for soft costs and hard costs on that project?
Good question. I don't know that I know the answers right off the bat. What I would say, and I think Jason alluded to this, is that if you think about the sort of area where you're doing water quality, it's effectively a landscape planter. It's no different than if you didn't have water running across the grasses. So the cost for that isn't really anything different than normal city requirement for streets. Similarly, on the paving now, at Bagby, there were areas of concrete, there were some areas of brick, but again, they weren't sort of in these extremes that you wouldn't find in some other nice streetscapes within the city. The bigger cost was really in the elements or those walled conditions that really enable the channelizing and the storage of some of that water, as Jason talked about with the market district. But I can, find some information offhand, and we can include it in the follow-up of this presentation for those that are interested in cost. But I would just generally say, all things being equal, the costs aren't really that different aside from the actual infrastructure elements that support the whole storm water. It's really the detention part of it. The water quality piece is actually pretty negligible in terms of cost.
Okay. Within the bounds of the case studies, were there locations that were highly contaminated with, gas stations and so on? And how did that affect the plan?
Yeah, contamination is very frequently an issue on most urban redevelopment projects, and it was no different on the market district. A significant plume associated, I think, with some former manufacturing, but I'm not really sure, but that spread well into the site. And so working around that was obviously the best way to do it. It doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to work around those conditions, but those were constraints on where we could place these systems. But again, with green infrastructure, you're dealing with surface flows. You're keeping things at the ground plane versus a traditional gray infrastructure approach. You're digging bigger trenches, depending on where you are and what the frost lines are. You have to dig deeper and deeper to provide that cover. So the deeper you go, the more likely you're going to get into those plumes of contaminated soil. So the green infrastructure was a tool that we were able to use to get around or over that contaminated soil. What it typically does, and we see this a lot in the South Bay of San Francisco, they've got quite a few contaminated groundwater conditions, and so infiltration is not an option. It's actually precluded. So where we have ponds or wetlands, we actually have to line them so that we can ensure the counties and the cities that there will be no additional water adding to those plumes and causing them to move or alter in any way.
Okay, we're going to detail
question. Frank, to your cost question, we got some really good cost numbers for market district that we could provide, and what it really showed in the end is that, and the developer wanted to see this, that doing this district approach cost them less per gallon of water managed by doing it that way versus on a site-by-site basis. So it was an absolute dollar savings.
Okay. I'm going to take a detailed question here, and then we'll get to the social equity question here. How does the stormwater tank work below street tree planters? Why didn't you just provide a larger and deeper street tree planter to allow roots of the trees in the area? I think you were integrating it as a part of a bioswale, no?
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
Jim.
No, you go.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a conflict between the two to a degree, and so where the trees were laid out, I mean, we had I think about a 4-foot root ball depth. Obviously, those sections had to have a deeper below grade storage element, but they weren't continuous, and so we had spaces in between the trees where we could have a full depth storage element, but the amount of space that we had, when you look at all the linear feet in an urban grid, you've got quite a bit of space. If you look at both sides of the streets, you've got 150 by 150 or 200 by 200 foot block. That's a lot of frontage with a lot of space to put these systems in. So it was fairly easy to work around that. And you can also put those systems, spread them underneath the sidewalk, under the hardscape as well. They don't have to just be located underneath the street trees. It's just it's a volume. Where that volume goes is not as important.
Okay. In the examples that you guys talked about in the approaches, how do they help with the social equity concerns of the neighborhoods and address the needs of the marginalized citizens in those particular areas?
If I could speak to a couple of those from the standpoint of some of the projects in downtown LA, right? I grew up in Los Angeles, and downtown LA 25 years ago was not a place that anybody spent any time at, right? It was really rival to going to work and then leave the city at 5 o'clock. But a lot of these projects have revitalized the city in such a way that it's now a destination. And so you look at districts like the Arts District or places near the LA River that become energized by these projects. And so it's something like the Million Knot project. It's literally a 2-minute walk to the LA River. And so it begins to create these connected pathways that are to the other side, say in the Boyle Heights area, that it's historically was a part of the city that did not have access to the trails or to amenities, right? And so it begins to create these opportunities in changing the fabric of the city.
Okay, great. Another detailed question. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the typical maintenance aspects of these elements, especially the landscape choices and the buried pumps and filters? I think a lot of the infrastructure in the street is buried, and you're working around that, right?
Yeah, very true. And in the Des Moines condition, like I said, we came up with this division split between what would be under the purview of a third-party operator and the purview of the city's DPW. Everything that we put within the traveled way between the curbs, we were very cognizant of what their standards were, so that the pipes, the materials, the catch basins, the inlets, the manholes, that all of those, the curbs, that all of those fell within their standards, so that they felt comfortable that their DPW would know exactly what to do when they had to maintain those elements. And then the elements that were outside of it, we worked with these actual third parties that would be enlisted to maintain furnishings and pavers, make sure that they could also maintain the green infrastructure elements as well. So it's really about vetting to make sure that we use the appropriate soil types, that we had the right turn downs on the curbs, that we had the right inlets within those bioswales. So it was really just about working with the appropriate parties that would be the ones maintaining it and making sure that they felt comfortable that they could maintain it. And then getting representative costs as well. You can imagine the clients wanted to know what they're going to be contracting for. So we worked with them closely to make sure that we tailored the design to address any red flags that they saw locally as being outside of their comfort zone. And usually there's plenty of alternatives that you can put in place, whether it's changing material or changing a depth or a location or what have you. But just the iterative process of design lands you on that. But key to engage, not doing a design in a vacuum, but thinking about who is going to be operating this, talking with them early on, and designing collaboratively.
The other, sorry to add, I just wanted to make a brief comment about what Jason said, which is really important to build off. So it's this delineation between who's responsible for what part of caring for these improvements. It's another to figure out the economics, how do you monetize all of that? And so we worked really closely with the city and the master developer to determine, those relative costs for, let's call it landscape or upkeep on any of the infrastructure that was behind the curb, so that the master developer and city could devise an economic model, a business plan to which those who develop here and or operate in this district are basically assessed a tax, that tax is used for the care and the upkeep of that district, to which has created, all of these benefits. So, figuring out, it's one thing to figure out the design side, So another to help figure out the economics and the business components that really need to be done, hand in glove, so to speak.
You gotta love this one. In cold weather projects, have you found ways to effectively counteract road treatment like salt and its effect on the landscape? That's spot on.
Yeah. Yes. It
Comes
is
up all the time.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, that exact question came from the DPW. Obviously, the preference is to claim something like it's not going to be salt that's used for de-icing, but changing that standard is going to impose a challenge on the city. So it really comes down to essentially designing the planting palette to be able to endure that type of abuse, essentially, and designing an expectation of it. I haven't found a magical solution for that. And, to say that the regime for de-icing is just going to change and that's the solution, it's kind of pushing it off. Obviously, if you can do that, that's preferable, but to expect that that's going to be the case is short-sighted.
So there's really not much alternative to salt at all.
Oh, there are alternatives to it. It's just a matter of, your DPW in your town, wherever you're working, if salt is what they use, to tell them that on this one street you're designing, they have to use a different type of de-icing process, they're gonna probably tell you to go to hell. So you have to design assuming that. Doesn't mean you shouldn't push the issue and see if you can change that, but designing to accommodate it is essential.
I think in Des Moines, they actually were, as a city, trying to adopt sort of best practices when it came to salt, the use of that. And even there are different forms of salt, some of which are a little more benign, and they had adopted, at least a better approach on how to deal with that issue. Not, again, it doesn't solve the problem, but it helps mitigate it a little more than if they didn't try to do that on their own.
I'm from Death Valley. We tried to grow grass with salt water and it wasn't too successful. But anyway, with football season upon us, how expensive is it to have storage tanks under these playing fields and practice fields to use as irrigation instead of regular watering systems? What is the economics of having such a storage system versus water costs? Does it make sense to do it?
I think, if I may quickly add, again, the economics are going to vary by the footprint, the size of the project, right, and the size of the fields. But there are stormwater solutions out there, like the EPIC system that allows you to collect water under a sports field, under a landscaped area, and by capillary action allows it to basically provide that irrigation benefit. And so as we start looking at those co-benefits, right, those systems can be installed on grade or on structure. If this was a sports field on structure, right, there is that added benefit of that cooling effect from collected stormwater. Landscape over structure tends to dry out as well, right, depending on the thickness of that layer. So it's about layering those co-benefits and then looking at the footprint of the project itself to see if it makes the financial case for it.
Yeah, and really tactically speaking, the buildup of your section, whatever it is, a road section, the sidewalk, a sports field in this case, looking at that gradient of materials and seeing if you can alter one of those materials that can provide a larger porosity that can store that water. So swapping out a standard road base gravel that has very low porosity for a higher porosity, broken stone, clean material that has the same structural integrity, wrapping that in a filter fabric if need be, that can provide a significant amount of detention or water management attenuation without much cost. So it's looking at the tools you already have in place. If you can use an alternative material that you're otherwise going to buy, that's the best option. That's a pretty practical one that we've used quite a bit.
We have a request to see if you could direct us to case studies for smaller scale SFR installations, and maybe you could provide some and we can put those online with the PowerPoints so that they could catch those there. That would be really nice. Do you recommend Silva cells to come with widget at a higher cost?
We actually have we're working on a couple of projects where we propose them, and actually right now we have a project in construction in Hillsburg, California, up in the northern end. It's actually an entire district that's going to use solar cells over 3 public street city blocks, and basically providing that treatment not only for water for the public right of way, but also providing that benefit for future parcel soil development. And so along those lines of what Jason was describing earlier, right, developing that third-party mechanism that's going to provide that maintenance element in that permitting path with the city of Hillsburg in order to address it. So yeah, there's an entire district in the public right of way that's using it, that's going to be using it. It's in construction right now.
I got a detailed question. Go ahead.
Based on that, but my experience with Silvacell is it's really about protecting the root zones, keeping pore space, allowing the roots to be able to spread as far as possible. We use that in Hudson Yards, for instance. That was on one of the projects in my bio. And there was really about making sure there was enough root zone that was accessible to the roots. It wasn't about stormwater management. If it's just about stormwater management, Silvacells aren't really the solution.
It's a urban forestry really issue as a whole. And there's a ton of literature which we can provide links for, that cities are doing demonstration, prototypes along streetscape improvements just to measure, the sort of growth rates of a tree in a Silvacell condition versus a tree in a standard planted condition. And the evidence is overwhelming that, as Jason just said, the amount of root area that the Silvacell provides, along with the porosity and the aeration, is far better for the tree in the long run. You get a healthier, bigger tree, which has all sorts of benefits. But yes, there is a cost that comes with that up front. So it's really a cost, but it's an ROI question at the end of the day. But there's a lot of study underway by cities and third parties to determine, what that ROI is in different areas of the country, in different applications.
I got a policy question, but I got one for my New York buddy there. We talked about salt earlier. The other thing we see is when areas of high snowfall, they just plow the snow right back up onto the right onto the sidewalks. That's got to affect the bioswales that we're looking at here. I mean, like
Yeah.
salt.
Yeah, and we had that same conversation with the folks at the city of Des Moines, because we realized that over time, a plow operator wasn't going to really care about where they were pushing snow, and that would have a detrimental effect over the long term to the plants, right? Either crushing them or compacting the soil. So we actually worked through a kind of a snow storage plan to identify where we sort of didn't have a lot of landscape, or where we had edges and areas of hardscape where they could actually push snow to. So the hope is, as this project's developed, which is under construction, that the city is going to follow through on that plan. But it's going to have to be one that the master developer and the city are going to have to, observe and manage. But that's at least one way in which to try to solve that problem.
Okay. This is the policy question that we get to. How can we influence policy and the mindset in an environment where the maximization of building floor space and vehicular circulation are prioritized? Because in essence, we're trying to put a premium on open green space, and that seems to be of little use to developers. And so we're trying to always show the value of the open space and these amenities, and its value over, cars. Cars are more important to people, or people are more important than cars.
Yeah.
And that's a tough question, but it's on the front end,
It is a difficult question. It's a question that we all have to work every day to try to solve or address. I would say that part of what I hope people have gotten from this is the need to sort of measure things and have demonstrative sort of performance-based outputs from these projects, because at the end of the day, a lot of what we're talking about, yes, may have some initial cost upfront from the norm or the status quo, but in the long term, they can return way more in all sorts of sort of financial or monetary ways. And it's just having bodies, kind of a body of evidence to continue to show elected officials and stakeholders, for that matter, how these things do make their lives better, and from a health and wellness to an economic perspective. But it is pretty much a daily fight that I think all of us on the front line have to wage, because people want to, you're right, the car is king, and development is, it's not easy to develop, especially in places that have a lot of regulation. And so, there's a lot of headwinds in that.
But my background in city planning, Jim, it always tells me that there are studies out there that measure the before and after
Right.
when these improvements have been made, but it doesn't seem like there's a central place that collects those kinds of studies that you can go to and say, hey, I can prove my case here,
Right.
here, and here. And
Yeah, no, and that's right, Frank. And I would point everybody to one place that you can go to, which is the Landscape Architecture Foundation, which is a subset, a nonprofit. Its mandate is to collect, best case studies for any number of sort of, they're mainly more focused on landscape than they are on buildings, but they inevitably do involve buildings and architecture and urban design. And the hope is that through measurement and these kind of performance-based projects is to demonstrate all the co-benefits that come with it, and to have that act as kind of a repository for people to get access to that information, to learn from it, to engage universities. I mean, that's one of the good things about that program, the case study program that LAF has, is that they align projects with universities. So the universities are actually measuring the sort of post-construction performance of projects from any number of perspectives. So there is at least that. I'm sure there are others that I'm not aware of or can't remember right now, but we need to do a better job.
the follow-up on that, Jim, is that you get into traffic calming and you push out into the street, you get more landscaping, you get larger sidewalks, so you got more of a pedestrian emphasis. But then there always seems to be the wall between the store and the building. You can't spread out onto the sidewalk with, like the cafes in Europe,
Right.
because that's sort of the next step. I mean, when you've got that, you've got life,
Yeah, that's right.
And
yeah, I mean, there's just so many factors around even just that issue that you pointed out to, Frank. Again, it's some of that's design, but a lot of it is policy. And there's been small projects that have worked out, agreements like license agreements to do, alcohol sales in a public right of way, but they're few and far between. Again, there's kind of economics, politics, design all rolled into that. But, at some point, hopefully we can move more to this idea that, and that's why the last takeaway here is the public versus private, that it's so essential to build, ideas through both sides of this, because both have to, kind of come to alignment and agreement about all of these big ideas that we all know as designers will really improve the lives of people that we're designing for, right? The real users of our buildings and our public spaces, and and the elements of infrastructure.
last comment, and then we got to close. But with COVID-19, I know in our area, you've been allowed to expand onto the sidewalks and out into the street. Now, normal's coming back, and people don't want to give up the amenities of enjoying the life that they've now got, because the pandemic forced it. So, I mean, it's just case in point. So anyway.
Yeah, no, the hope is that some cities we've heard and read about are actually going to vacate the the accessing of cars in a street that they've closed down because of the pandemic. Some cities like in Vancouver, British Columbia, they actually did a whole analysis, a modeling to determine of the streets that they thought they should close down, that they kind of by science measured how people were moving throughout the city and concluded that there were areas of the city that didn't really need to be served by the automobile anymore. So could imagine that more cities were able to undertake that type of analysis and study to use science to determine, where people really need to drive and where they may not necessarily need to drive their cars.
That would be a first.
Yeah.
Okay, big thank you again to Jim, Jimmy, and Jason for an excellent presentation. I would like to thank everybody who made it this far. AIA California staff will submit your time for the AIA credits, so don't have to worry about that. It will appear on your transcript in a few weeks. There'll be more resources on AIA California's website, and there'll be a few more. The one question we had about additional resources, we'll get an answer to you and publish that there as well. And on the website, you'll find more about the upcoming 2021 Climate Action Webinar Series and what's coming next. And you'll also get a notice by email. So thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you again. And thank you guys for making a really exciting subject here meaningful. So
Well,
with
thanks
that,
to you. Yeah.
we're off to the races. Have a good
All
day.
right. Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
For having us.